All right, so let me go through the first one, the Preterist Amillennialism. Uh, and I want to do this because um, R.C. Sproul, for example, had this view. He was very influential. A lot of super academic people have this view. And so it's also the easiest one, given what we have said so far, to start with. So, a preterist amillennialist believes that the kingdom started with Jesus, and that means that the millennium, for them, the millennium started with the resurrection of Jesus. And that means that we're in this age where Satan can't stop or thwart the church. And so he's bound and he's not able to stop the church. And so the church grows throughout the world, and many people come into it. And then that leads to when history ends. And a preterist amillennialist, and by the way, there is an extreme version of preterism that is really bad. We're going to talk about that, or actually, maybe we can talk about it now. But I just want to talk about more the typical preterist. They believe that we're in the millennium now, and that in the future Jesus is going to return. There will be a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. Then there'll be the final judgment, and then people will go to eternal punishment in hell or to the new heaven and new earth. The only thing that this perspective adds to what we've already talked about, Anthony, is that they're very explicit that the millennial reign in Revelation 20 is talking about the binding of Satan and the expansion of the church, that the righteous are with God when they die in the heavenlies. They're with Jesus, they're reigning with Jesus. And it also means that the church can expand its influence and spread throughout the earth. So it's very similar to what we have said. And like I said, a lot of people in Presbyterian circles, Church of Christ circles, some academic perspectives, of United Methodists or Lutherans will adopt this view. In fact, a lot of times you'll find this view highly correlated with people who have sort of studied at places like Harvard and Princeton and places like that. And I personally believe that academics can tend to, if they're not careful, I want to pick my words here, can try to avoid God intervening in this world. And, it tends toward, and these people would not, but tends to more of a kind of a deistic worldview where God sent Jesus and redeemed us, and God's not doing much till Jesus comes back. And again, that's probably not 100% fair to that view, but it is something I've struggled with as I've read the scholars. I was trained in my graduate programs by people who are more preterist and amillennial. Now, there is a version of this that actually I think is heresy. So let me mention it. These are people who believe that Jesus already came back. We've
Hmm.
already had the resurrection of the dead and the final judgment. So it's an extreme view that sees that uh, Jesus came back in 70 AD, and that when the Bible talks about that's already happened. And the reason that I think it's heretical is because it takes away from the real return of Jesus that you and I talked about. It's
Yeah.
contrary to the earliest Christian statements of faith, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. It is a view that doesn't hold that there's a future final judgment, that all that's already happened. And for example, in 2 Thessalonians 2, the Apostle Paul clearly says that Jesus will not come back until the man of lawlessness appears, and that the man of lawlessness is going to be is going to be destroyed by Jesus in his second coming. So you may think that that's a symbolic thing that Jesus is going to do when he returns, but there are countless difficulties with this hyper-preterism, and I just encourage those listening or those watching on YouTube to realize that it is a view that a very, very small number have, and it's highly problematical. It's a heretical view, and I urge everyone to stay away from it on biblical grounds. I mean, just read Matthew 24, and you will realize Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and Revelation 19, and you'll see some major difficulties. And they have to jump through hoops to explain these passages away, and we don't need to do that.
Let
Again,
me ask you
the
this,
best,
Bobby, before we get into the next one. When do they place? I know you said AD 70, but how do they deal with the rest of, you know, him coming back and judgment and like raising of the dead? Like where do they
yeah.
put that?
So let's talk about it. Do you remember how we talked about apocalyptic literature? That Revelation is the
Right.
unveiling apocalypse. So everybody has to recognize there's some degree of symbolic um, literature and the nature of Revelation and some of these other passages, that there's symbolic um, language there. Now,
Mm-hmm.
there's different ways to deal with it. Some people are still approach the book of Revelation still pretty literalistically. Now, there's places where they have to admit, this beast wasn't like a real beast, but the
Mm-hmm.
beast represents a political empire or a political leader, or that the you know the stars that fall in Revelation 13,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
everybody has to admit, yeah, those are angels, because earlier in Revelation it actually tells us that. But they like to, wherever they can, read it literalistically. Other people like to read it as symbol, and anything that can be literal, they don't want it to be literal. It's all symbolic. So it's kind of like they're the exact opposite of the people who tend to be uh, read things overly literalistic. The other group is everything is just uber symbolic. You can't really understand anything. Like I was discipled by people who were uh, more preterist amillennial, and like I try to get them to go through the book of Revelation with me and explain it, and they just say, well, it's all symbolic. Everything that happens is just symbolic. So what they do then, when it talks about the second coming, for example, in Matthew 24, where Jesus talked about the desolation, the abomination that causes desolation, what they say is that's all symbolic of AD 70, and the whole thing is talking about Jesus' return in AD 70. They make overly symbolic everything that it says, and it's because they, again, is, in my opinion, overly rationalistic. They want a God. They I don't know if they want this, but they gravitate to a God who's in the box, and uh, that all of this has been fulfilled and everything is just overly symbolic. So, literally, the second coming, the resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment, those are just symbolic things that already happened in 70 AD. And again, it's just nobody believed this kind of stuff in the early church. It's contrary to lots of passages. Again, I've encouraged our listeners to read these passages yourself, and you'll see that it's just crazy stuff, and it's heresy. It's just heresy, and I recommend everybody stay away from it. Now, I've overdone it on the hyper-preterism, because there is a preterism by people like R.C. Sproul and a lot of good scholars in churches of Christ, Christian churches, Presbyterians who are waiting for the second coming, who do believe in the resurrection of the dead and all of that. They're not extreme preterists. So I want to
Gotcha.
delineate that view.
Gotcha. And then on to classic amillennialism.
Is that enough on that one,
I mean
Anthony?
that was I think you hit I think you hit the nail on the head as hard as it could have been hit. No, you did that one quite well. So that's the
Okay.
preterist
Let
amillennialism.
me talk about the classical millennial view,
Okay.
and just reveal my cards. This is what I believe the Bible teaches. Um, as I've mentioned, I was trained otherwise, but for reasons, and we'll get into this, I came to see that what I was trained in, I just can't go there. I don't think it's right. So, in classic amillennialism, of course, you have leading up to Jesus is the Old Testament prophetic era where there's prophecies about Jesus, there's prophecies about God renewing the land and all of that. And I believe that'll ultimately, those promises in the Old Testament are ultimately going to be fulfilled in the new heaven and new earth. So, what I believe is that Satan was bound, that the millennium started with the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and that the church has been expanding throughout the world, that Satan can't thwart it, and that the church or the kingdom is expanding and will continue to expand until people from every nation, tribe, and language have been reached. Now, I'm going to go back to the Protestant reformers in the 1500s, many of whom had views similar to what I'm describing. For example, in my reading of Martin Luther, he has, but not just them, Christians in the second and third centuries. A lot of them were premillennialists, but a lot of them too, or I should say, some of them were more classic amillennialists like I am. So here's what we believe is that Satan, after the gospel goes to all the kingdoms, that Satan is going to be loosed, that he and the demons were bound in the abyss, and they're going to be released. And that will result, and on the diagram it has number 4, last days decline and great tribulation. I personally believe there'll be an antichrist. I believe there'll be a major false prophet. I believe there'll be tribulations and tremendous difficulties on planet Earth. But then Jesus will intervene. Now, I believe, and a lot of classic amillennialists believe, but not all of them, a lot of them believe, like I do, that there'll be a massive conversion of Jewish people to faith in the Messiah at the end. I believe it's described, and we'll look at this in Zechariah 12 through 14. So that Jesus returns, we have the resurrection of the living and the dead. There is a final judgment, and then people go and are condemned to hell, or the righteous who trusted in Jesus and followed Jesus will go spend eternity with him in the new heaven and the new earth.
So the amillennialist, they both view the 1,000 years as a symbolic time, not
That's
a
correct.
literal 1,000 years. Okay.
It's a symbolic period for the reign of Christ through the church. Now, let me address something about the 1,000 years. In Plato, who was the disciple of Socrates, very influential Greek writer, and in the first century, of course, everybody to the area where the book of Revelation was written in Asia Minor. There's seven cities, seven churches there. They would have all been very familiar with Plato, and they would have been very familiar with the Republic. And in the book, The Republic, the 1,000 years in Plato is a period of temporary judgment. And so they have a repertoire of that is not literal, but it's a period of undefined temporary judgment. So I believe that that best fits what's going on in the book of Revelation. And we will go through this where I'll make the case. But what is being described in Revelation 20, 1 through 6, is described similarly without the language of 1,000 years, but there's similar descriptions in the book of Revelation. And because I understand the book of Revelation to be recapitulation, that things are said starting in Revelation chapter 6, and they're said in different ways. The same things are said in like waves coming on the shore. They're saying the same thing in different ways up through Revelation chapter 20, verse 12, 11 and 12. So it's just recapitulating, and that the description is this period from the first coming of Jesus to the second coming of Jesus, and how the church expands. And then at the end, after the millennium, after this undefined period where the church expands, Satan will be unleashed, and he will cause the persecution and the tribulation and the antichrist that I described.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the again, the amillennialist, the time period is symbolic, but it does describe that reign of Christ and the church.
That's right.
But then the next position or positions believe that the 1,000 years is literal of
Yeah.
the.
So
Okay.
let's move now. We've talked about um, the preterist amillennialism, the classic amillennialism, the postmillennialism, which will be the last view we look at, also looks at the millennium as symbolic of the reign of Christ, and that Satan can't stop him. But now we're going to stop and look at premillennialism. So there's
Gotcha.
two views again: historic premillennialism and then dispensational premillennialism. And that language comes from we're living in the period before the millennial reign. So let me describe historic premillennialism, and let me acknowledge that in the early church, this would have been more the dominant view in the second, third, and fourth centuries. Now, by the time of Augustine, writing in the early 400s, that changes because Augustine he's a very strong advocate that the millennium is symbolic of the reign of Christ in the church. But let me walk you through it. So again, historic premillennialist looks at the Old Testament era as pointing to Christ. Christ comes, and the church age begins, and the kingdom expands in the sense of it's not a fully consummated kingdom, which, by the way, I believe the same, that the kingdom is expanding, and but the millennium hasn't started yet. Then, toward the end, things decline, things get worse. You have the last days decline, there's tribulations, the breakdown in society. And then that leads to a great tribulation period with an antichrist, with cosmic disruptions, with the increase in evil. And things get really bad. And then Jesus intervenes. The saints are resurrected. They rise up to meet him in the air. He brings with him the righteous who have died in the past. And then there is a pause, and the righteous will live on earth for a literal 1,000 years. So they live on earth for 1,000 years. And at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is unleashed. There's another apostasy. And then God just stops it all. He intervenes, has the final judgment, and the wicked go to hell, and the righteous go to the new heaven and new earth.
And so you say this was the position that the early church would have had kind of a majority, or I wouldn't say majority, but many of the earlier church would have thought,
It, it,
hey, we're
it
living
probably,
before this millennium.
yeah, to be fair, probably in the earliest period, this was the view. It wasn't the only view, it was the majority view.
Gotcha.
Amillennialism was there, just the dominant view was more of this premillennial view that I've just described to you.
And then the dispensational premillennialist, that was much later on, or would you say modern or recent?
Yeah, in fact, it doesn't really begin until the 1830s. Before I talk
Okay.
about dispensational premillennialism, for those listening, Craig Blumberg is a really good scholar, and he joined together with Sonny Chung, and they wrote a book called "The Case for Historic Premillennialism." And so I'd recommend that book for people who are wanting to study this more. The next view is the dispensational premillennial view. So, in popular literature, popular Christianity, especially in charismatic churches, a lot of Baptist churches, a lot of Assembly of God churches, this is a very common view. As I said, it's taught at Dallas Theological Seminary, and some very popular books have adopted it. So let me walk you through it again. Old Testament is describing what's going to happen, and then the church age begins with Jesus. But here's what they believe, Anthony. Once the church age begins with Jesus, they believe the prophetic clock regarding Israel stops. So they have a complicated view that comes out of Daniel chapter 9. Now, let me say, I'm going to explain the view here, but I want our listeners or those who are watching us on YouTube to know nobody had this view till like 1830. So it's a view that comes from a guy named Darby and the Plymouth Brethren. So John Nelson Darby and the Plymouth Brethren. It had a really big influence in American history because of the Schofield Reference Bible from the like 190 something or other, the early 1900s. This was the view taught in that Bible, and a lot of people read it. And then when Dallas Theological Seminary was started, I believe in the 1920s, that seminary had a lot of influence. So let me give you three character traits. We'll just walk through it. But the first is the prophetic clock stops, and then the prophetic clock with Israel and God's focus on Israel is going to come back. But it doesn't come back until the church, which means all the Christians, are raptured up out of the earth, and they meet Jesus in the clouds. So all the Christians are removed. History goes on, and then God focuses on Israel. You have the appearance of the Antichrist, and there's a 7-year tribulation. So let me just walk through each part again. And again, download our ebook. You can get the diagrams or watch on YouTube if you're not. You've got the prophetic era pointing to Jesus. The church age begins. And then there's this last days start to decline type thing. And the Christians are removed from the earth. So the Christians are removed before any difficulty and tribulation. They're
Mm.
Okay? So they're raptured, and then the great tribulation begins. The focus switches to Jewish people. The prophetic clock starts again, and the Antichrist is revealed. And he's revealed. There's tremendous persecution and tribulation. And then finally, Jesus comes back. There's 7 years of tribulation. Jesus comes back, and then the millennium. functions for 1,000 years. So it's in the future after Jesus comes back. Dispensational premillennialists literally have to advocate for, and they'll nuance this better than I would. It's actually they have two comings of Jesus. Once for the rapture, and then 7 years later, he comes for everybody else. Okay,
Mm,
uh,
yeah,
which is
that just seems to. I just tend to struggle with that, Bobby,
yeah,
because he would come back one time and that be it. And this, you've got multiple times just in this discussion.
yeah, they would just say that, well, it's one time, like 7 years, just takes 7 years. This one time,
Gotcha,
but it takes
gotcha.
7 years is what they would say. I think you're making a fair point, but I'm trying to represent them
Hmm.
accurately because I do want our listeners to evaluate these things for themselves. So he comes back, and then literally for 1,000 years, Satan is bound. Uh, People live in paradise. It's focused on the promises to Israel in the Old Testament. All of those promises of the land and all of that are fulfilled in the millennium. But then again, after 1,000 years, Satan is loosed. There's an apostasy, and then God intervenes. He intervenes. There's a resurrection of all people. God consigns the wicked to hell, and the righteous go and spend eternity with him in the new heaven and new earth. Now, there's a couple recently, because of critiques, dispensationalism's been modified a little bit, and there's a couple of good scholars who've written a good book on it. Craig Blasing and Darrell Bach have a book called Progressive Dispensationalism. So some of the areas where they have been critiqued, they try to tidy that up a bit, and I would recommend that to our listeners.
All right. And then we had the final one um, that we would discuss in this session,
Post
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 millennialism.
millennialism. This is the view we all want to be true. I want it to be true. If I were, so often in the Bible, I'm just thinking like, God, why did you do it that way? Or no, God, I don't like that. And then, of course, in my life, after all these years, I've always come around to say, okay, God, not only am I going to go along with your view, but I can see why it's a better view. So anyway, this is the view, just kind of making fun that um, I would want to be true. And that is, in fact, I used to hear a lot of this when I was growing up. They had this expression every day and every way, things are getting better and better. And it was a real optimistic view of the future. So, in this view, again, you have Old Testament prophecy leading up to Jesus. And then with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, Satan is bound. There's some difficulties in the early years after Jesus. Uh, that you see that a little bit in the Book of Revelation and in early church history. But then the church, the millennial reign, gives great power to the church, and there's the kingdom of God expands. There's this thing called gospel prosperity where it just gets better and better and better. Now, just before the end, Satan is loosed and there's a brief rebellion, but then Jesus returns. You have the resurrection of all people, the final judgment, and people go to hell, uh, and then the righteous go to the new heaven and new earth. But the idea is that more and more people come to Jesus. Uh, throughout the whole world. They follow the ways of Jesus. Things just get better and better and better. And the people who have this view, the thing that I like about it, that makes me want it to be true, is it's really a optimistic view of the future and of life. And of course,
Bobby, what's
we would.
what's what's wrong with the optimism, man?
I love optimism, and I personally am very optimistic. about God in your life and my life and in the life of everybody who follows Jesus. But I believe that in this world, Jesus put it well, uh, we will have trouble and tribulation, but take heart, he's overcome the world. So I'm
That sounds
optimistic.
optimistic. That sounds optimistic to me.
It is.
I have overcome the world, he said.
But I also believe we're going to go through tribulations and difficulties,
I
and
got you.
a lot of people are going to fall away. But I'm optimistic for those who trust and follow Jesus, especially if they have grit. But I'm not as optimistic that the whole world is going to be that way. I just don't think the text teaches it. I think the Bible
Gotcha.
teaches us, of an increase in wickedness that's, comes before the end. That's way more than what a postmillennialist believes.
Mm. We didn't get into uh, the what was the other one that you gave, the pan millennialist. It'll all
Oh,
pan out,
yes.
or
And we don't like that view though.
listen, we hope that you have enjoyed this deep dive into five different paradigms, perspectives on the millennium, and some other things that we will be looking at as well. We hope that it has been kind of an explainer for you. And as Bobby said, if you take on the perspective of a learner, we hope that you've learned something even about a position that you probably already hold, but even as well as others. But out of respect, we hope that we have represented these perspectives well. We want to engage with you also. Share with us in the comments some areas that you felt like we didn't hit too well, or we did excellent on. We'd love to hear from you. And we also want to remind you we have a free ebook that deals with everything that we've been discussing in this series. And we encourage you to download it at renew.org/end times. We want to get that free ebook to you, and we encourage you to share it with others as well, so that you can follow along with us in this podcast. So, listen, we thank you for sticking in it with us on this time, and we are anticipating being back with you again on next episode. Anthony Walker here with Bobby Harrington. Thank you all for
Yeah.
joining us in Scripture in Black and White.
Thank you.